Welcome to Players Only, your backstage pass behind the scenes of today's PC and video game industry. I'm Scott Steinberg, and this week we're exploring the topic of convergence, the intersection between Hollywood, the recording industry, and video games. Co-host Diana Falzone, Casey Young, and I ask, does it really matter, and will they all play nicely together?
Other media industries are really interested in gaming right now because the gaming industry is growing extremely fast. It's one of the only media industries that's really been growing in the last few years, and there's a tremendous opportunity for them to expand their audiences.
You know, the convergence between movies and games is one of those interesting things. There's this sort of idea of how do you take these different disparate elements from these other areas and make them into either, translate them into a movie or translate them back into a game. For games, the expectation of the audience is you've got something that's playable and fun to get under your thumb. For a movie, the expectation is for someone who's going to sit down and watch it from a big distance and completely immerse themselves in it. So to have those things converge, you take the things that work for both. So for example, playing a game, awesome camera work and immersive sounds work great for games, they work great for movies. But you're not going to have a lot of dialogue-heavy drama scenes in a video game. It's very difficult to pull that off and make that actionable.
The C word for me is collision, not convergence. And then convergence implies that it's kind of, that we know what we're doing and it's flowing together. I think it's just sort of bumping and smashing into each other. It's happening. I'm working on an animated movie. I talk to a lot of designers. I talk to a lot of internet marketers. We have the same conversations. Filmmakers. We just end up having all sorts of crossover.
I'll tell you, convergence in concept is very real. In application, it's very hard to achieve. And a lot of it is like we want to use the databases that we have databases built, and then we help. Those same databases are fueling the movie, fueling a television series, fueling the game. It's true digital backlot stuff. And what people don't realize is when that really meets its hardest hurdle to cross, it's not a technological hurdle. It's not even a production hurdle. It's a legal hurdle. Because you have the film studio wants to own all their databases. The television studio says, well, isn't it a show? We want to own all the data. And then the game companies are like, oh, we want to own it. And you're like, guys, don't you all want to make more money?
So I think games that are based on intellectual properties that exist are, have a burden. But it's not as inescapable. They have, shorter times usually. They're sort of shelf dates that they have to make based on the release of the film. I think all of that, here's the movie at the forefront, and here's all this kind of trash that follows it. Your calendars and your wind-up dolls and all your stuff. And studios are considering video games that are, relate to movies. They're considering that merchandising, and I think that's the flaw.
All right, but if video games shouldn't be considered just soulless product, how to make them stand out?
I think the main secret is to realize that we have a different form of entertainment. It's not linear. We're telling stories that are centered around the player, so we have to make them the centerpiece of what we're doing. We're trying to make it so that people feel like they're heroic in everything that they do. That's a very different form of communication than telling the story that you're watching on a screen.
So when working with a movie-based property like Bourne, we want to recreate, at least to a certain extent, the look and feel of the movie, to have that connection with the original license. Well, we go to the source material, which is the movie itself, and before we had any concept art, we watched the movie over and over, we dissected it, we took it apart artistically and story-wise, and we tried to figure it out from all angles, like technically what we could do, visually what we could do, story-wise what we could do, and ultimately, even though it started out as a movie, it has to be a game now.
The Bourne movies, even though the action sequences are what everybody remembers, there's a lot of sequences that aren't about the action. But a game has to have a lot more action. So how do you, make those two things work together? And that's what we spent a lot of our time doing, is making sure that we had the Bourne video game experience dialed in, as opposed to saying, well, we're trying to exactly duplicate the novels or the movies.
We try to have a flexible approach, but it always starts out with pencil to paper, sketches, and then iteration after iteration, refinement. And it's not a closed environment where it's just a concept artist down. We're very collaborative. We bring in our game designers, our mechanics designers, we talk to the programmers what's possible. Our animators are involved, storyboard artists, our cinematics guys. And there's always this conversation going on, and we're always trying to make sure that we're addressing all the issues.
Still, what about the biggest question of all? Is convergence real, or is it just BS?
We've been hearing this for, 15, 20 years now, the fact that there's this convergence between film and games and everything. And I think what's really happening is that games are just getting more tools exposed to them so they can tell deeper, more detailed stories, so they can have AI that respond a little less like automatons and a little more like the characters you need to express your narrative. So convergence, I think, is a bit of a misnomer. It's not that games should want to be like Hollywood or that Hollywood should want to be like games. It's that the games now have more toys in their toy box in which to tell a deeper story.
Well, I certainly think the things that are in this year's top games, things like BioShock, the way narrative is employed to compel you to want to drive through that city and to continue to employ the mission and still be physically challenged is really important. Right. And I think you'll see more of that. I think that the ability to have more characters that you can relate to, and that there's the technological changes that allow game makers to present things in the way that filmmakers do.
Narrative in gaming, I just feel like there's something. There are new forms of narrative that are about to be born if they're not happening already, and I just think it's important that we all start talking and communicating with each other.
I'm not a big believer in cinematic games, actually. I think movies are movies and games are games, and we should learn what we can from each other, but kind of do what we do best. The thing that everybody has to remember is that stories are not games, and games are not stories. Stories provide a context for player action. Games are about players doing stuff. And what stories do is they make the doing important. It's more interesting to save your brother or let your brother die than it is to go shoot a bunch of pixels so another bunch of pixels can actually make it to the next screen. Stories provide context and significance for player actions in games, and that's it. And anybody who tries to make more, go make a movie.
Games, movies, music. Never mind the medium. The real question is, how's it all coming together?
Well, we're launching films and television shows first, and we're on development on those. And then if you really understand sort of what the business deal structure on it is in that climate, you understand why it would be better to have a movie attached to a game rather than trying to have a publisher finance a game as a new IP right out of the gate. So the convergence idea is blooming. The convergence implementation is still very elementary.
I hear about convergence all the time, but I think historically the opposite has been true. It's mostly divergence. I think we're on more game platforms now than we've ever been, whether it be you can play games on an airplane, you can play it on your iPod, you can play it on phones. I mean, this is an area where actually divergence is happening, and games are going everywhere you could possibly be in as small a time segment as can possibly be played.
The one thing I'm absolutely sure of is that we're going to be doing a lot of changing. And convergence are people trying to create rational structures. I actually don't believe in convergence. I actually think we're constantly in a state of divergence, and that the only thing that converges are the historical remnants of various businesses that become sort of the trailing edge, where size is important but innovation is not. And so I think people talking about convergence are really looking behind themselves. They're not looking forward.
One thing we know you'll be looking forward to, though, is next week's episode of Players Only.